Hey everyone, I just want to make a quick MySensors troubleshooting video. I'm by no means an expert in this area, but I thought it might be useful for those of you who are just starting out and didn't really know how to troubleshoot any of the issues that might pop up. If you're watching this, I'm sure you've experienced some sort of issue. It's not uncommon if you're building your own hardware to run into issues, whether it's a malfunctioning part or an error in the code, miswired, anything like that. So I just want to make a quick video to hopefully at least give you a couple of pointers on how you might go about troubleshooting some MySensors problems. So generally I think there's 2 or 3 broad categories for where things can go wrong. Hardware, software, and depending on how you classify it, radio transmissions would be the third. So I'll go through each of those categories in just a second, but what if you're not sure where to start troubleshooting? You don't have any idea where the problem might be. Well, when I'm troubleshooting, the first thing I usually do is turn on the serial monitor. To use the serial monitor, the first thing you're going to have to do is upload the code with debug enabled. So to enable debug, you're going to have to open up the myconfig.h file in the MySensors library, and then you're going to uncomment define debug. Next, you'd go back to your sketch and you'd upload it. So for this example, I'm going to be using the Nano to upload my code and demonstrate the serial monitor. But you could also use your FTDI adapter if you're using a Pro Mini. So that's what I normally use in my projects, is the Pro Mini. But for simplicity and ease, I'm just going to use my Nano. So I'll connect that in and I'll upload my sketch again with debug enabled. So after I've uploaded my sketch, I'll turn on my serial monitor. Now it's important to set your serial monitor to the 115200 baud rate, otherwise the serial monitor won't work correctly. Okay, so this is what it should look like if your sensor is working correctly. So it's initializing with my library version here, and then it's going to send my sketch information, and then now it's going to transfer my data from this motion sensor. So as soon as I activate the motion sensor, it sends over a 1, and notice the status here is OK. So that transmission was good and everything worked correctly. So if something's not working correctly, occasionally you'll see it in here. Sometimes you'll see a status fail or a miswired message, and then you could check your wiring for that. If you see status fail, that's probably a hardware issue. So you can bring the gateway closer to test that, and then I'll go into some other troubleshooting steps in the hardware side in a second here. But before we do that, I wanted to show you some other tips for if you're combining code or creating your own sketches. One of the things you may find useful is adding serial print or print lines throughout your code to determine values. So serial print line will just put a hard return after it prints it out. So you can see in the monitor here, it put in tripped value and then it put a hard return, so it's ready for this next message. But if I wanted to, I could add some text before it. I often do this if I have multiple lines that I'm trying to debug outputting to the serial monitor. So I could just say something like this: serial print like that, and then I know what that number is that's being outputted into the serial monitor. Now this is such a small section of code that it doesn't really matter. I wouldn't need to add this additional thing, but I've had hundreds of lines of code and I'm not sure where I screwed up, whether it was an array or a variable or whatever. So then I put these serial print lines all throughout my code, and then I can see where it actually went wrong. So I find serial print line very useful if I've added custom code but I'm getting errors and I don't know where they are. Okay, so now that I've talked through some of the software troubleshooting techniques I use, let's talk a little bit about hardware troubleshooting. So first I just want to cover some of the easy basic stuff. Things like check your data sheets. So each of these sensors that we use in the MySensors projects, they can all require different power. So it's important to check your data sheet and find out what it needs. The MySensors page is really good about showing you what type of power you need to supply. Just make sure you follow that. If you supply the wrong power to sensors, sometimes they'll look like they're working, but they're not. Another common mistake I seem to make is not checking where my connections are actually going, or not double checking, triple checking. So I might swap VCC for ground either on my sensor or maybe on my Arduino. So just make sure you watch out for that. Make sure you supply it with the right power it needs, and then your connections are actually wired in correctly. I can't tell you how many times I've wired something in, I swear it was correct, and then just to find out after troubleshooting my software that I just put the cable in the wrong pin. So double check that, triple check it. The other thing I like to do whenever possible is get multiple sensors, because usually my projects will have use for multiple sensors. So I have motion sensors throughout my house to turn on my lights, things like that. But it's incredibly helpful for me to test. I don't think I've ever actually had a piece of hardware go bad yet, but there have definitely been times where I've thought that it was the hardware and then swapped it out, had the same results, and then found the error somewhere else, whether it was in a wire, miswired, or maybe software error, something like that. So if you can, if they're cheap, multiple sensors is always a great step for troubleshooting, to just switch out that sensor to know that that's not the problem. Now there is a chance that you could get two bad sensors, which would be awful, but less likely. So I already mentioned double checking your connections to make sure they're correct. But another thing that I run into is, and you'll notice this if you've watched any of my other videos, that I use these prototyping PCB boards here. So those require soldering and then smaller wires. So I've actually had it where it looks like my solder was correct. You know, I could see it and it looked like it was all correct in there. But it actually was a bad solder joint, so it didn't actually make a connection. And I solder in things like this tiny little 3.3 voltage regulator, so it's really hard to get it on, to get it soldered correctly. So one of the things that I find is very useful for troubleshooting when you're doing smaller projects and soldering is a good multimeter like this. So I can just set it over to the ohm setting, and then I can check my connections. If you've never done this, I'm sure there's plenty of videos, but just a basic overview here. When I touch these two connections together, it'll change to 4 zeros and show that it's a connection. So I can quickly, test my parts that I solder on this prototyping board here to make sure that my connections are good. So if you don't have one, I highly recommend a good multimeter to test with. Okay, moving on from checking the connections, I would say one of the biggest causes of issues that I have with my sensors is power. That may range from not having enough power or having dirty power. So power is very important for these different sensors and microcontrollers. So I recommend getting some voltage regulators to power your radio and your sensors. So whenever possible, I try not to power my sensors from my Arduino. Sometimes it looks like the sensor is powered up, but it's not getting enough power, so it'll give you strange results. Other times your radio will not work correctly or not be transmitting far enough because you have a dirty power source or not enough power from your Arduino. So whenever possible, I'll supply it from my external power source. So what that would look like is instead of running the power from my Arduino here to my motion sensor, is I would take the power that's going to power my Arduino and then just run an additional ground and 5 volts or 3.3 volts depending on what's required to my sensor. Same goes for the radio. If you can supply it with an external 3.3 volt regulator, this is an example of a larger one here if this is too small to solder in. Another thing we recommend for having to do with power is putting a capacitor between ground and power for your radio. That can help filter out the spikes and also provide it with additional power if needed when it's transmitting. So the recommendation is a 4.7 microfarad capacitor. The microfarad is just a little UF, so 4.7 capacitor between ground and your 3.3 volt power source. Alright, so now let's talk a little bit about radio transmissions. So at the beginning of this video I mentioned that there were software issues that could happen, hardware issues that could happen, and depending on how you look at it, radio transmissions could be included as a separate category. So I've already mentioned in the hardware section a couple of ways to improve your radio transmissions. is supplying good power to your radio. Is definitely a way to do that. So I'm going to show you a couple of other things you can do to help improve your transmissions. So the first one here is in the myconfig.h file again. So you have the option, and this is with the NRF24 by the way. I don't use any other types of radios yet, so I'm going to be focusing on specifically the NRF24. So for the NRF24 you can change the radio channel here. So if you wanted to pull up a Wi-Fi app on your phone to find a better Wi-Fi channel, you could find that and then type in the channel number. There's many resources online to find out what the channel here will transfer into the standard channels through Wi-Fi. So like 11, 4, 7, that type of thing does not line up with this number here. So you'll just have to go online to find that number out. The other thing you can try changing is your data rate. I personally have just left mine at the 250 kilobits per second. I haven't messed with that at all, but you could experiment with that if you wanted to. Also, you can change your PA level. I leave mine at max now, unless my sensor is really close to my gateway, just for ease of use, but you could also fine-tune yours here if you wanted to. So those are some things you can change in the myconfig.h file. If you find that that's not working, you may want to try to create a repeating node. So I'm just going to go to the MySensors website because this may change in future revisions. So I recommend you check out, depending on when you're watching this video, you check out the library API. So currently we're on 1.5, and the way to create a repeating node is in your gateway begin statement, which is in all of our MySensors code. You would just add true after auto. So what that will do is it will act as a relaying node. So any messages it receives, it will forward those on to the gateway. So you could put this in between some sensors that are having trouble communicating with your gateway, and it will relay those messages on. If you are going to build one of these repeating nodes, just make sure it's not battery powered, otherwise the battery will drain very, very quickly. The other thing I've done to improve my radio transmissions is to solder on an antenna onto my NRF radios. I've made a separate video, so I'm not going to discuss that too much here, but it's something to consider. I will mention though, some people have said that scientifically it could actually hinder your communication, but in my case it's actually always improved it. So I keep doing it, but I would say use it at your own risk. Another thing that I like to do when I'm troubleshooting my radio transmissions is to open up the log file in my home automation controller. What that will allow me to do is see all the radio transmissions that are coming in from my sensor. If your home automation controller doesn't have a great log file, I highly recommend checking out the MySys controller. So it's beyond the scope of this video to show you how to use it, but I did just want to mention it because this is an awesome tool. I use it in troubleshooting all the time. Just open this up, connect it into my gateway, and then I can see the messages stream in, so I can see what's happening from the gateway side of things rather than the node side of things. Lastly, I recommend checking out the MySensors forum. There's a ton of resources there for troubleshooting. People have probably already had the problem you're having and posted fixes for it, and if not, you can create your own post and get help. There's lots of helpful people there. So that's it. Thanks everyone for watching.